Tonight, a regular party executive meeting wouldn't normally set pulses racing, but that's just not how things work in the DUP. The party's top brass were in Lurgan to hear from Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, with everyone wondering if he's planning a return to Stormont. We'll have the latest from the meeting, we'll hear from Geoffrey Donaldson himself, and we'll have expert analysis on how the DUP leader makes his next move without splitting his party. And with unionism on the precipice once again, we consider what the late PUP leader David Irvine would be making of it all.
David Irvine was an extraordinarily positive figure, a man of courage and conviction, who also wasn't afraid to make compromise.
I also believe Davy was a visionary and that he totally believed in what he was doing.
Hello, the DUP has been desperately talking down its significance for days, but some commentators believe tonight's executive meeting in Lurgan was part of the necessary choreography for Geoffrey Donaldson to manoeuvre his members over to where he wants them, backing a return to the Stormont institutions. Next Saturday's annual conference is likely to be decision time for the party, but tonight's gathering has still prompted a lot of media interest. Our political editor, Enda McLafferty, has been watching events unfold all night, and he joins me from Lurgan now. Enda, any white smoke?
Yes, well, Mark, the meeting wrapped up here within the past half hour or so. Around 130, we're told, members of the DUP executive arrived here shortly after 8 o'clock this evening, and they spent the best part of that time listening to the party leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, as he briefed them on those ongoing negotiations with the government over the party's concerns around the Windsor framework. Now, the party told us initially this was going to be a routine discussion. There was nothing much to see here, and I think that is probably how it turned out, went according to the script, I think, as far as the DUP are concerned. So let's get a sense of what exactly happened inside that room this evening, because I am joined right now by the leader of the DUP, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. So did it all go according to plan?
Yes, we had a very good meeting this evening, and it was a scheduled meeting. We have 4 meetings of our party executive every year. This was one of them. It was a very constructive discussion that we had. As you say, I was able to report to our party executive on the progress of the discussions with the government about our concerns, our ongoing concerns in relation to the Windsor framework, and how that falls short of what is needed to restore Northern Ireland's ability to trade within the United Kingdom and our Article 6 rights, and that's what we're endeavouring to achieve in these discussions.
So what were the sticking points? What did you tell those members of yours inside as to where currently it falls down as far as you're concerned?
Well, the first thing, Enda, is that we need legislation. We need to protect Northern Ireland's ability to trade with the rest of the United Kingdom in UK law. And secondly, we need to look at the practical arrangements so that they reflect what the Prime Minister told us would happen under the Windsor framework. That is, that goods flowing within the United Kingdom and its internal market would flow freely, and that's what we want to achieve.
Is it not a bit late for that? Because we know that the Windsor framework is already in operation. Those red and green lanes have already started to operate this week with checks on the green lane. So hasn't that ship sailed, in other words?
Not at all. This is only phase 1 of implementation. There's still a long way to go, and the issues that we have raised still need to be addressed. After all, the objective here is to see our political institutions restored on a sound foundation, on a basis that unionists as well as nationalists can support. We mustn't lose sight of that, and I'm determined to try and get the outcome that we need to restore that stability.
We know, of course, DUP executive meetings didn't always go according to plan in the past. Were there any dissenting voices in there? Did you come under any pressure at all from those in the room?
There were absolutely no dissenting voices. Our party officers had unanimously agreed several weeks ago on the approach we would take in these talks. We have adhered to that approach, and that unanimity was reflected in the meeting this evening. There is a determination to take this forward. We want to get the right outcome for Northern Ireland that respects and protects our place in the United Kingdom. That's what we're aiming to do, and we're doing it as a party that is focused on the task in hand.
What about the pressure outside your party, those who weren't here this evening but have been making a lot of noise lately about what you and your party should do? Are you feeling the heat from them?
Not at all. On this autumn evening, it's actually quite cool out here, but we will take our own counsel and we will make our own decisions as to what needs to happen. The DUP has been consistent in its approach right from the beginning of my leadership. Back in July, 1st of July 2021, I set out a roadmap, and we're still on that roadmap, still working to that plan to see Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom properly restored, properly protected in law, and to see those institutions functioning in a way that has the support of unionists as well as nationalists.
So do you think, is it helpful when the Secretary of State tells us all that the Irish Sea border is working unbelievably well, is what he put it this week when he talked about the Windsor Framework?
Well, my job is to achieve what the Prime Minister said. And what the Prime Minister said was that in relation to the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, that we would remove a sense that there's a border on the movement of those goods. And we want to deliver for Northern Ireland, for our businesses, for the people of Northern Ireland, an outcome that works for everyone, that gives us the stability and the sustainability that's required, but fundamentally for me, and that protects our place in the United Kingdom.
You'll know, of course, the frustration being felt by many business leaders out there. We've heard this week, for instance, from the Chief Executive of Harland and Wolff, who says that the lack of political movement here is putting future investment, that he sees it, at risk. And he had a message. He said we should stop playing these games.
Well, I'm certainly not playing any game. Despite the fact that there happens to be a referee in the game. I am playing to get this sorted out. I want our businesses to have certainty. I want Northern Ireland and the people of Northern Ireland to know that their place in the United Kingdom, our ability to trade with our biggest market, is protected in law, and that's fundamentally important.
But what do you say
economy.
to the boss of Harland and Wolff and other businesses out there who are fast running out of patience around all of this?
Well, we'll be meeting with the boss of Harland and Wolff as we do with other business representatives. Of course we listen to what business has to say, and that's why we were the only party after the Windsor Framework to take the time to go and consult, to listen to what people had to say, including business leaders, and we took their concerns, we presented to them to the government, and we're waiting for a solution. Look, if we can get the solution we need, agreement can be reached very quickly, but it's down to the government. We're waiting on their response. Let's see what they have to say, and let's take these discussions forward. I want to see a prosperous Northern Ireland. I want businesses to thrive, but when we are impeded from trading with our biggest market, which is the rest of the United Kingdom, that's a problem for all businesses and for our economy.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for stepping out to talk to us on the programme this evening. So there you have it, Mark. We do understand that the government is due to correspond with the DUP again next week to respond to some of the concerns the party has raised. So we'll watch and see what develops from this space.
And very interesting to hear Sir Geoffrey playing that effectively with a straight bat tonight. I just wonder what you think is the answer to the question that I suspect people will be wondering tonight, and that is, despite the fact that the DUP has been playing this meeting down tonight, is it, in your view, nonetheless part of the choreography if, as expected, the government puts its offer on the table sometime next week, which will be a matter of days before the DUP's annual conference next Saturday?
Well, I think there were no big decisions tonight, Mark, but this was probably part of the decision-making process for the DUP, for the party leader to be able to canvass opinion among the executive members on the ground, to test the water, if you like, with whatever he might see coming down the track, just to see what the party's bottom line is going to be. But you're right, it's interesting, of course, that the government's coming back next week, but we don't expect Sir Geoffrey Donaldson to be put under any immediate pressure to respond to that. I think the government will look to his speech at the conference next weekend just to pick up any clues as to what they put on the table might be going down with the rest of the party, to see if there's much more room left for this negotiating process. And then I think beyond that, the last 2 weeks in October and maybe the first week in November, I think that's been looked at as a key moment where a lot of this probably might have to be nailed down. And if it's not nailed down, then of course we're looking at beyond the general election, because the sense we got in Manchester this week from the government is that before long they're going to move on and start focusing on that election battle.
OK, and thanks very much for now. We'll come back to you in a bit, but let's just widen the discussion on how the DUP and unionism more broadly decides where to go next. I'm joined by the newsletter columnist Owen Polly, the Belfast Telegraph's political editor Suzanne Breen, and Professor John Tong from the University of Liverpool. Welcome to all of you. Suzanne, first of all, what do you make of what Sir Geoffrey had to say there? No dissenting voices inside, he told Enda, and he's not feeling the heat.
Well, I think there was a lot of work went on behind the scenes to ensure that there was no dissenting voices in public tonight. We have seen DUP executive meetings that have been nights of high drama. This clearly wasn't one of them. But that doesn't mean that there aren't serious divisions within the party. The party is united in terms of asking the government for certain things. The government has papers that have been presented by the party. But where the problems will come for Sir Geoffrey is in the government's response. And, it is my understanding that he is minded to be flexible with the government and to compromise in the greater interests of Northern Ireland and of the Union. But the problem for him will be getting the numbers. Can he bring others in the party with him? And he does have his supporters, people that we see standing side by side with him at various press events. But it's the big beasts of the party that so far he hasn't got on side. People like Nigel Dodds, Edwin Poots and Sammy Wilson. He really desperately needs to bring some of them along if he is to take the DUP back to Stormont. And so far there are no signs that any of them are likely to compromise with what the government is offering if it doesn't really improve on that.
Owen Polly, do you get any sense that compromise is in the air?
Well, in a way, I don't think that it's a particularly promising moment for compromise, to be perfectly honest, because only just this week we've seen the Windsor framework put in place. We've seen green lanes, red lanes. We've seen not for EU labelling and indeed postal regulations that could affect the postal market in Northern Ireland, the mail order market in Northern Ireland quite profoundly. So the idea that this was the moment, that there was the fork in the road, that this was the moment when the DUP was going to kind of change direction, I was never quite persuaded by that.
You still don't think that Sir Geoffrey wants to make a move? You don't think that maybe if there's an offer from the government next week, he might have something significant to say next Saturday at his annual conference?
I don't necessarily think that he doesn't want to make a move. I'm not saying that there's not divisions in the party, but what I have observed throughout the summer and up to this date is that the DUP has been quite consistent in what it said about the Windsor framework, quite consistent in the demands that it's making of the government as regards the Northern Ireland Protocol. And really, I haven't seen any indication that that's changing, particularly. But if there's an offer on the table, then I suppose they have to look at it. But at the moment, you would say that the Conservative government is not going to be in place for another year or longer than that. And really its record of delivery, its record of delivering on the promises that it's made has been very patchy up to now. OK, let's bring in Professor John Tong from the University of Liverpool. John, no dissenting voices, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson was very keen to point out there. But of course he hasn't moved yet, so there's nothing for them technically to dissent about.
Well, no dissenting voices, but there's been plenty of strident voices within the DUP, which have made Geoffrey Donaldson's job rather difficult if he does want to take his party back into Stormont. I mean, the first thing Geoffrey Donaldson's got to do is grab the steering wheel and throw everyone else out of the cab, because you've had all sorts of people trying to steer the DUP in different directions over the last few months. I mean, remember, even before the ink was dry on the Windsor framework, you had one MP in Paisley saying it didn't cut the mustard, and that made it impossible for the DUP to go in straight away anyway. And since then, you've had both people within the DUP and people beyond the DUP who've made it very, very clear that the DUP should not go back into Stormont. But I think Sir Geoffrey's comments were interesting to Enya McLafferty earlier, because Sir Geoffrey tacitly, in a couple of things he said, accepted that the Windsor framework was here to stay and that the debate now was about implementation. I've been in Manchester at the Conservative Party conference this week, and Chris Seaton-Harris, although he didn't say much of consequence about Northern Ireland in his speech, he did basically say that the debate had moved on to implementation of the Windsor framework. It was here to stay, and he would be sympathetic to noises about, or representations about, trying to deal with the minutiae, the implementation of the Windsor framework. So the debate has moved on, that the Windsor framework is implemented. It isn't going to go away. Keir Starmer isn't going to remove it if he becomes Prime Minister in a year's time. So it's a question, I think, for the DUP of, do you accept that deal? And do you then try and mitigate the Windsor framework by trying to expand the trusted traders in the Green Channel, make sure that most trade goes to the Green Channel, and have the minimal border, because I think, you know, the debate really has shifted now towards details of implementation rather than throwing the entire framework out.
Do you think that if he gets something from the British government, he will be keen to try to interpret it in a way that allows him to make the move that many commentators say he wants to make?
Well, it is high risk because opinion polls have consistently suggested that the bulk of DUP supporters support the current strategy of staying out of Stormont. There is some opinion poll evidence that suggests that pro-union voters as a whole would prefer power sharing to remain in place and not bring power sharing down full stop. You've got to remember that the DUP, the biggest gamble the DUP ever took in its political history was in 2006, 2007, after the St Andrews Agreement, when it went into Stormont. Did it do the DUP any harm? No, they were the glory days of the DUP from 2007 to 2016. Their polling went up. They were up to 30%, a figure they could only dream of these days. So I think the DUP, Jeffrey Donaldson, has got to look at how much he can move the DUP support behind going into Stormont, rather than necessarily letting the current opinion within DUP supporters, which is in favour of staying out of Stormont at the moment. Can Jeffrey Donaldson shift the DUP support behind the move? I think he probably can, but to do that, he needs his party whole square behind him. And that's why I don't think he'll take many risks at the conference week on Saturday, because there could be blood on the carpet. It could be, you know, you could have, if the party divides very publicly at its conference, that would be a nightmare scenario. So I think you'll see Jeffrey Donaldson put his party in a sort of holding pattern, awaiting clarification of the mood of his party, given in response to what the government does offer.
Suzanne, can I just ask you about the clear unrest that exists within certain parts of unionism and loyalism at the moment? I mean, Sir Geoffrey was very clear talking to Enda that he's not feeling the heat at the moment from those who may be opposed to any move should he choose to go down that road. But there clearly are individuals, perhaps organisations, which are preparing for, you know, what they've referred to as a sellout. They think that there could be some kind of movement coming that they would be uncomfortable with. How concerned should the DUP senior leadership, those close to Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, be about that?
Well, I think Geoffrey Donaldson and the senior DUP leadership will be very concerned, despite what they say publicly. We have seen before Geoffrey Donaldson share platforms with Jamie Bryson and with Jim Allister, and that is fine and dandy. But the moment that Geoffrey Donaldson decides to compromise, then I think both Jamie Bryson and the people he represents and Jim Allister will completely and absolutely savage them. We have seen Jamie Bryson talk this week about feet on the street, about protests, about challenging the DUP electorally. Now, Geoffrey Donaldson will have in his mind exactly what happened to David Trimble. We saw the UUP effectively decimated, and we saw David Trimble's life made very, very hard in his own constituency. The TUV is already applying the pressure to the DUP. I think there are ads in media over the next few days, full-page ads from Jim Allister, reminding the DUP of its 7 tests and talking about 7 reasons not to go back in Stormont. And none of that would matter if opinion polls showed that unionist voters were willing to compromise. But as John has showed, opinion polls don't show that. They show that unionist voters are very much behind the DUP's strategy of boycotting Stormont and wanted to stay that way until the protocol isn't amended, but is scrapped, is binned, and quite frankly, that's not possible.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there a letter that was written to Sir Geoffrey from one individual who's got a bit of profile, apparently on behalf of some kind of loyalist organisation, the membership of which appears to be a closely guarded secret. Do you think that Sir Geoffrey Donaldson's calculation is that maybe individuals are making a bit of noise at the moment, but when it comes to it, he, as the leader of the biggest party within unionism, will see them off?
Maybe he does think that, and who knows, maybe that is all talk. Maybe if the DUP compromises, the protests will fizzle out. But that is a very, very big chance for Geoffrey Donaldson to actually take. And his problem is that he has shared platforms with these people. He has mainstreamed them. He has given them credibility. Has he created a monster which potentially could savage him?
I would just want to bring in Owen Polly again briefly, but just to comment on a tweet from Chris Donnelly, who's a commentator, comes from a nationalist background, of course. He says, another night of unionist navel-gazing. It's tiresome watching the ever-entitled being so indulged while the rest of us move on. And there will be people watching this discussion tonight who will agree with that sentiment, you would imagine.
Yes, well, I can understand that, and I also understand the argument that the DUP has run out of road on this tactic, and that actually it's becoming counterproductive, and that it may become counterproductive from a unionist point of view eventually and start to damage the union. But at the same time, it is based on very real problems with the framework, real problems with the Irish Sea border, real fears, and a sense among many people that this government has really dismantled parts of the union in response to demands essentially.
Yeah, but there's a couple of things though that you're throwing together into the one pot. I mean, there may, to a greater or lesser extent, be difficulties with the operation of the Windsor framework and the Irish Sea border. That's one issue, and a lot of the people who support the DUP getting back into government as quickly as possible would say that that's right, and those need to be worked through. The other issue about the constitutional security of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom is a completely separate issue that some people believe has been blown out of all proportion.
Well, I don't think it's fair to say that it's been blown out of all proportion at all.
No, but you wouldn't, but there are people who do think that.
Yes, I understand that. And yes, I accept the validity of the argument that perhaps we need Stormont back and that perhaps it's damaging not to have Stormont. But from the DUP's point of view, essentially what it's looking at here is consistency. And if the DUP is to make an argument for going back, it has to be on an honest basis that what it has tried so far has failed. It hasn't achieved its aims, and not on the basis that somehow that this has been solved or the government's come up with a piece of legislation that makes this go away. Because I think if that happens, then people will be angry and they won't accept the rationale.
Let's bring in the writer, commentator and former Labour Special Advisor Kevin Maher, who's also joined us tonight. Kevin, I'm not sure how much of this conversation you've managed to hear, but what's your assessment of where we are vis-à-vis the DUP making a decision to stay where it is at the moment or to try to find a way back into operating devolution at Stormont? Do you think we're any closer to that happening tonight?
I'm an optimist, so yes, I think there's probably an awful lot going on beneath the surface. There's, the word choreography has been used repeatedly tonight, and I suspect this is another piece of that choreography. But there comes a point in politics where leadership is about having to bolt across open ground occasionally, and sometimes when you do that, people on your own side take pot shots at you for doing that. And I think that moment is coming up for Jeffrey Donaldson, and I think there's only so much you can do to try and finesse an approach and get something across the line, which is divisive for people within the unionist family. But ultimately, this is what political leadership amounts to. It's about being able to meet, a gap that doesn't appear to be able to be bridged initially. It needs to be bridged often through bravery and through direct leadership. I mean, Jeffrey Donaldson talked about having a roadmap. Well, unfortunately, what we've seen for the last 18 months is that roadmap leads into a cul-de-sac. And what the DUP's position with this boycott is that it's a tactic in search of a strategy. And what Jeffrey Donaldson desperately needs, and what we all need, is a strategy that gets us back to business and gets the institutions back up and running again. And we've had a lot of noises off over the last year. Lots of people opposing the protocol and the Windsor framework in principle, calling for it to be scrapped. Clearly, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, that's not where the debate is anymore. What Jeffrey Donaldson is asking for is effectively tweaks to it. Now, if he can carry the bulk of his party on the basis of a confection of small, minor tweaks to that arrangement that Chris Eaton-Harris can come up with in the next few days, then perhaps we'll get somewhere. But I think we need to be clear that the Windsor framework is not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere under this government, and it's not going anywhere under a future government either. And I think we need to start on the basis of what is realistic. And I think that's where we've gone wrong probably for the last 18 months.
I think, Kevin, it's fair to say that Jeffrey Donaldson's not likely to be asking you for advice, though you were a paid advisor
I would doubt it, to be fair.
to Sean Woodward when he was Secretary of State. But if Jeffrey Donaldson asked you for advice, what would you say he should be thinking about to try to square the circle, keep his party with him and deliver on devolution without presumably losing face? Is that possible in your view at all, in fact?
Well, a lot of the spade work that might make this process easier just hasn't been done. I mean, it's very clear with the prize that's on offer in terms of the ability to trade both in the UK market, but also within the EU single market. You know, this could be an absolute economic boon for Northern Ireland. You could see British companies relocating to Belfast and Derry and what have you. There's a great opportunity. And of course, we're weeks away from this major US trade delegation as well. And it looks as though, yet again, there's nobody for them to meet because the institutions won't be up and running. So there needs to be some positives put into this equation that say, don't look at all the negatives about all of this. There are positives too. They're very objective. They are positives. But nobody within unionism is making that case. And as I say, there's a point here coming up for Jeffrey Donaldson personally, but also for the people around him, where they're going to have to bolt for open ground. And they're going to have to be brave, and they're going to have to try and take on some of the naysayers within their party, which they've not done so far.
OK, I want to go to Enda McLafferty in just a moment, but before I do, Professor John Tong, just before we let you go, can Sir Jeffrey Donaldson square the circle in your view?
Yeah, I think he can. I think that he will try and eventually lead his party back into Stormont, because how do you make Northern Ireland, how do you secure Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom? By collapsing its political institutions. At a very basic level, that simply doesn't make sense. And yes, the DUP, it is problematic for them to have an economic border dividing one part of the United Kingdom for another. But nonetheless, I don't think there's a clear alternative that Jeffrey Donaldson could really pursue. OK. Thanks very much indeed. I just want to go back finally to Enda McLafferty to hear from him before we wrap this conversation up. And I suppose what people will want to know is, we've covered a lot of ground tonight. What happens next?
Well, the lights have gone out here, Mark, you might see behind me, so I think Sir Jeffrey Donaldson will be pretty pleased at how things went this evening. That said, of course, we may hear other voices offering their assessment tomorrow. We know sometimes that's how the DUP works when it comes to big gatherings like this. I think the DUP leader has a job of work to do, because we know that there are so many competing voices within his party, pulling them in different directions. Edwin Pooch, for instance, talking about seismic changes from the government before he's pleased with what lands on the table. So you can see the challenge that faces him. But I think one thing we know for sure, Mark, this won't be the last DUP executive meeting we attend before this process is over, because at some stage Sir Jeffrey Donaldson is going to have to prepare the ground for whatever is going to happen. He's either walking away from this process or he's going to try and make it work.
OK, well, we'll see what happens in the days ahead. For now, Enda and everybody else, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Now, what the late, widely admired PUP leader David Irvine might make of what's going on is a question that's been floated more than once since his death in 2007. A new play about Mr Irvine, charting his journey from loyalist prisoner to popular politician, has proved to be both a commercial and critical success. So what does the man who wrote it, himself a former convicted paramilitary, think about loyalism today and how it's been represented by writers? Well, earlier this week, I brought Robert Niblock together with Mark Phelan from Queen's University, an expert in the subject, right in the heart of East Belfast. You knew him very well. I think you spent time with him in this very social club. And he used to sit at this table. I think the night before he died, he sat in this chair. You also spent a lot of time with him in prison.
In prison, yeah.
In Long Cash. Is it your view that whatever he was doing today, he would have tried to be a constructive, positive voice for his community?
Yeah, 100%, Mark. I always thought Davy, and I knew Davy from I was 19. Davy was 20. He was a very, very genuine person. When he went into Long Cash, I didn't see him for a couple of years, and come back to Long Cash, and then I met up with him again, and he had this bit between his teeth that he wanted to do something positive. He had the influence of Gusty Spence and others, not just Gusty, but there was others who you had Billy Mitchell and you had Billy Hutchison and people like that, Eddie Kinner, Martin Snodden. They were all part of that process of moving things forward away from the conflict and into peace. Davy was so genuine about that, and he believed in it. I also believe Davy was a visionary, and that he totally believed in what he was doing.
It's interesting you use the word visionary. If there's a criticism directed towards loyalism, it's very often said that it tends to be a community that can be very inward-looking. Are you saying you think that David Irvine had somehow or other the breadth of vision to be able to see things on a bigger plane.
Well, I do, yeah, and I think the proof of that is that how it expanded. Well, you know, Davy was a leader of a small party, but he was universally liked and he was universally got. People believed in him, and I'm talking about the big parties. They may not have admitted it at times, but they were dependent on Davy at one stage, and they were dependent on what he could deliver.
Was that something to do with his personality? You must have thought about this a lot when you were writing the play. And the play has struck a real chord with audiences. It's been a popular success and a critical success. Do you think it was because he had a very positive personality? You know, he loved to sit in here, he liked his pint, he liked his pipe. He was a good talker. There was a warmth to David Irvine.
But I think he had that capacity, Mark, to bridge that gap, in that he could sit in the Raven Club with, for instance, the plebs and drink a pint, go to the bookies across the road, watch a football, go to the Glens match. But he could also go up to Stormont. He could go to Washington and mix and not feel out of place.
Mark Phelan, you're obviously coming at this subject from the point of view of an academic, somebody who knows a lot about the arts and a lot in particular about theatre. One of the arguments that we discuss very often when we're having conversations like this is that working class loyalism struggles to get its voice heard, as we've just heard from Robert himself. Does that stack up? Is that correct?
Well, there's an interesting contradiction there, because on one hand you have this idea of a crisis within maybe loyalist culture that may be in confidence, say, and yet when you take a look at the history of theatre and the arts here in Northern Ireland, and even prior to the foundation of the state, and you look back more than a century here, the tradition of theatre in the north is absolutely underpinned by working class Protestant playwrights. Going back to the earlier Ulster Literary Theatre that opened its door 2 weeks before the Abbey, St John Irvine, again a working class Protestant playwright, right through to Thomas Carnduff, who stood on the Abbey Theatre stage and said that he was an Orange man, a Belfast man, an Ulster man and an Irish writer. And he didn't see any contradictions in any of those identities. Right through to Sam Thompson, Stuart Parker, Graham Reid, Christina Reid, John Wilson Hare, John Boyd in the 70s.
Mary Jones.
Yeah, Mary Jones as well too, David Irvine, Stacey Gregg, Gary Mitchell and Robert. So there's a long litany of names there of Protestant playwrights from a working class tradition mostly. And yet you'll have DUP representatives like William Humphrey recently saying that, that the theatre has nothing to offer working class Protestants. And that speaks to maybe an ignorance there, or an unawareness of a long tradition, which actually it flies in the face of the facts.
So it says more maybe about the politician who is putting forward that argument than it does about the reality of what's actually been happening in theatres up and down the length of this country for decades.
Yeah, it's not just politicians, it's education as well too. Gary Mitchell, again, another working class playwright from a loyalist tradition.
Who has a play opening in the Lyric Theatre very soon.
Yeah, and I never met David Irvine, but in person, except one time, in the Abbey Theatre. Yeah. And it was for As the Beast Sleeps, a play set in Rathcoole, written by Gary Mitchell, set in the UDA, and David Irvine was attending that performance with his pipe. It was a fairly avuncular figure in the bar, and I thought it was not fantastic to see him there. But Gary Mitchell, when he went to speak to his careers teacher in school and said he wanted to be a writer, his education careers teacher told him that was a job for Catholics and homosexuals.
That's not actually what he said. What did he say?
He said fruits and fenians.
It's astonishing, actually, isn't it? That a teacher would say that to people who has a particular interest in the arts.
And yet Gary is one of our most important voices, and also places centre stage a community that is often marginalised and maligned. And I speak as somebody who's coming from a Catholic nationalist kind of background, and I have learned more about my own sectarianism and my own myopic views about politics here through watching plays written by Gary Mitchell, set in the loyalist community, where I realise that actually a loyalist isn't a single identity. There's a huge complexity to those positions. And similarly with Robert's play, where I learned so much.
Robert, whenever you hear that story as told by Mark, that a careers teacher should characterise theatre in that way, you don't want to go down that road, son, because it's for fruits and fenians. Does
Yeah.
does that strike a chord with you? Does it have the ring of truth to it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I was always led to believe that in many ways the Protestant or Loyalist or Unionist population who seemed or who were maligned for not attending theatre, their answer to that was, sure, theatre's only for fenians and the middle classes. You know, and that's not true. If you opt out, you can't blame other people for going. You know, that's the way I see it. The thing is, Mark, that if you don't take part in something, you can't blame someone else for taking part in it.
Well, I think theatre and the arts theatre is inherently a collaborative act between, you know, directors and writers, actors and theatre companies. So I'm not surprised to hear that, but I can absolutely see as well, you know, why a voice like Robert's is being encouraged to come to the stage, because it's tremendously important that I think, you know, and I'm from the other side of the political and sectarian fence, but it's really important for Loyalist voices to be given a platform on centre stage, literally and figuratively. And actually, which I think is different from maybe the political representation or articulation very often of loyalism, to have something positive to say, because David Irvine was an extraordinarily positive figure, a man of courage and conviction, who also wasn't afraid to make compromise and was well loved, as you say, across the political divide. And his leadership has left us all massively impoverished. But he had a positive narrative about what a loyalist was and what it's about. And I think the theatre can also be a way to provide a more of a positive and uplifting representation.
Yeah.
Some people listening to this conversation might think that there is a fine line between articulating the views of a community and, frankly, propaganda. Should we be concerned about giving a platform for people to put forward an argument that is pure propaganda?
Propaganda is bad theatre. It won't ever sell out houses. I mean, what's very interesting is the mixture in Robert's play. It's the personal and the political. There's a scene towards the end of the play in which David Irvine cuts down his young grandson, who's killed himself at 14. And it devastated me. And it devastated the audience. And it also brings home how this is a terrible plight for young men, particularly, affecting everybody across, doesn't respect turf and territory, and it affects us all equally. And it's also a huge reminder, and the theatre is a wonderful empathy machine, where you realise we're not talking about politicians or paramilitaries or preachers or green and orange. We're talking about people. And we have to share this place and space, just like you do in an auditorium, as you do in the city streets. And I think it's absolutely as far removed from propaganda as you can think.
Just a final thought from both of you about, I suppose, what you think the positive role theatre can play in helping to tell the story of this place. It's a very complex story. I mean, loyalism is complex. It's very factionalised. We know that from its history, and we know that probably from its present. If you had to make the case for theatre in the 21st century in a place like Northern Ireland, Mark, what would you say?
Theatre is the only shared space we have in this society, where you still have parks cleaved with peace walls. You know, it's the only place where you can actually have audiences from different backgrounds sitting in an auditorium, you know, not only just as a form telling stories, whether it's loyalist or Republican, or from the victims of paramilitary violence or state violence for that matter. You can have those stories told from different perspectives, but also it's a room in which you have to listen, you know. And an example of that, when I saw the Man Who Swallowed a Dictionary, and I saw it twice, but the second time I saw Robert sitting at the back of the theatre, and the guest that he had sitting with him was Lawrence McKeown, the former IRA blanket man and hunger striker, both of them watching the play. That framed my perspective of watching the play. And I just thought, what a fantastic image that was of two men from very different, one still a loyalist, one still a Republican, watching this play and talking about the drama, and the drama of those momentous events from 25 odd years ago, but also the legacy of David Irvine and the complicated nature of our peace process. And I thought our politicians could be put to shame from what these men are doing in their work and in their actions. And I found a remarkable privilege to kind of watch the play.
Two former prisoners, two current playwrights.
Yeah, I've done some other work with Lawrence, and I find him very accessible. He's very similar to myself in that I feel he's truthful about his past, and he doesn't have a problem relating it and putting it into a drama form. I feel, as Mark says, that when you're writing drama, particularly about past conflict or about Northern Ireland, you can take some artistic license. You get away with some stuff. You can say stuff on stage you couldn't be able to say on your show, for instance, you know, because whatever. But I feel that it's a great vehicle for getting stories out there and for getting messages out there. The feedback I've got, particularly in this recent play, is that I've had not just Lawrence McKeown, I've had many Republicans at the play, ex-prisoners or whatever, politicians, people right across the board, and I haven't heard one bad word yet. And I don't mean that in a big-headed way, that that's a great play, but they're saying to me, that was good.
Playwright Robert Nidblock and Mark Phelan talking to me earlier in the week. Suzanne Breen is still here for a final word. David Irvine is a fascinating character, and thinking about him at a time like this seems particularly relevant. What did you make of him, and what do you think he would make of what's happening at the moment?
Well, David Irvine was in many ways a breath of fresh air in Northern Ireland politics. He was somebody who was smart, he was charming, and I think probably most of all he had courage. He wasn't somebody who was dominated by the politics of fear, and his support, along with that of Gary McMichael and others, for the Good Friday Agreement was absolutely instrumental, because otherwise we would have had just the voices of the Reverend Ian Paisley. David Trimble desperately needed people in the Loyalist parties, needed that for credibility on the streets. And I think the problem basically now for the likes of Jeffrey Donaldson is that there aren't any David Irvine figures in loyalism taking the leap that David Irvine did. They're very, very different voices today.
You were at that event that Robert Niblock was talking about in that interview. He was on the panel. You were on the panel at the Harlan and Wolff Welders Club earlier in the week. And there were a lot of grassroots loyalists there. Was there any evidence that you saw of anyone from that community taking the David Irvine broader view?
No evidence whatsoever, Mark. There is just so much residual anger, I think, in the Loyalist community, and the protocol has become a vehicle for that anger. I mean, I heard a lot of voices talking about how Sinn Féin gets everything. Sinn Féin has power over the Chief Constable. The Catholic, Nationalist, Republican community are the winners. Loyalists are biased. There's bias against Loyalists in the media. There was an awful lot of hatred for the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. I think that had he walked into the club that night, he likely would have been lynched. And I think if any DUP leader walked in trying to sell a deal on the protocol that didn't mean it's scrapped, that they'd be lynched too.
OK. Interesting few days, weeks ahead. Suzanne, thank you as ever. That is it for tonight. I'll be back at the weekend with Sunday Politics at the usual time of 10 o'clock here on BBC One, when we'll be at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool and discussing the fallout from Keir Starmer's border poll comments. But for now, from everyone in the team, thanks for watching. Have a good night. From all of us, night night.